Welcome to this exclusive interview by France 24. We're here with Juan Manuel Santos, the president of Colombia. He's now arriving at the end of his two mandates of 8 years. Welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you here at France 24. And we decided to have to take stock of everything you did during the past 8 years.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I'm available to you.
So these 8 years since 2010 have been quite eventful. You managed to sign a peace agreement with the hardest guerrilla in Latin America, and you ended a major conflict and you won the Peace Nobel Prize. And yet you lost a referendum where you asked the population to approve this peace agreement, and your opponent, your biggest opponent, then Ivan Duque, won the elections. And he will take power on the 7th of August. So how can you explain this paradox?
On the one hand, as you mentioned already, Colombian democracy is working. You got all the guarantees for opponents to the government. Not only the one that won the elections, but the one that made it in the runoff is also an opponent. I had no candidate. I do not want to stick to power. I'm no caudillo. I do not want to be one, and that's the reason why I renounced running for elections, and I believe that democracy should be based on institutions, and the peace process has been subject to quite a lot of libel. Today, post-truths are fat and were applied to this process quite intensively. And the process was subject to quite a lot of dithering, as is the case in numerous referendums. For example, the Brexit, which occurred a few weeks before our referendum. But in the long term, the important thing is to have been able to save that peace process. And what came before the peace process was strengthened, and we approved all of the various constitutional legal reforms and decrees so as to be able to implement those agreements, and most especially insofar as the transitional justice, which is an example to the entire world. Today, Colombia is now facing up to a very different situation, very different to the situation we knew a few years ago. We experienced the calmest elections with the greatest turnout, and this is very good for democracy and very good for Colombia. I also believe that democracies need what we label power alternatives with new faces, new responsibilities, and this is very positive. And the important thing is for fundamentals, the very basics, to be worked out and maintained. This is very positive for Colombia, and I hope that my successors will carry on with those fundamental aspects of democracy.
Right, so talking about this, recently you had your first transition meeting with Ivan Duque. So how did it go? What was good about this meeting? What are you concerned about?
First of all, I've known Ivan Duque for quite a long time. He started his career with me at my foundation, Buen Gobierno, Good Government, and then when I got at the Ministry of Finances, he was with me as a minister, and then he worked at the IDB, and then he worked with Uribe when he was senator. Now he's president, so I know him, and he is pleasant. And he was extremely courteous when he visited me, the presidentials. And what really reassured me is that he said something that made a lot of sense, and it was very smart. He said that he was going to carry on with those policies that worked, that had been working, and that he was going to correct those that were not that effective, and that he also had his own initiative, and any new government has to have its own initiatives, and this is something that makes a lot of sense. He doesn't want to do away with everything that had been done before.
And don't you think, as many do in Colombia, that the one truly holding the power in the end is Alberto Uribe?
I hope not. I hope that he will be smart enough to understand the following. Life is giving him an opportunity which very few human beings are able to experience, being the president of a complex country such as Colombia. And governing this country is not easy. And this 4-year period represents an opportunity in a lifetime. If he's influenced by someone who's going to be upstaging him, then history is going to make him pay for it. I hope that he's not going to make that mistake, and I hope that he is going to be unflinching and have enough character to make the decisions without anybody to jump in.
I wanted to ask you a question regarding everything that you've done, everything that you've succeeded since the signature of the peace deal. It's been a year and a half now. Many people criticize the fact that the implementation takes quite a long time sometimes in some areas because of bureaucratic pitfalls. So how do you consider all this? What do you take out of this?
First of all, the results are very positive. I'm not the one saying that, but those observers named by both parties, 2 former presidents for Spain, Felipe González and Mr. Mujica from Uruguay, and they came twice to take stock of the situation in Colombia. The government is displaying the results, and the former guerrilla is also displaying the results. And it was said that indeed all of the engagements made were implemented, and in any piece of agreement, in any normal situation, all of the agreements would have been implemented. And as a proof here, Mr. Timochenko voted for the very first time in his life, not as a former guerrilla commander, but as a president of a disarmed political party. We celebrated the first anniversary of the disarmament, and the country has changed. The FARC represent a political party. They are ready to participate in the work of the Republic's Congress, and what would have been normal in any peace agreement is already implemented. And an additional thing has to be mentioned, transitional justice. And this is the first time we negotiated this principle between 2 parties under the auspices of the Statute of Rome, and this had never been done before. What does that mean? For the very first time, there is going to be a transitional justice under the Rome Statute that will guarantee no impunity when it comes to crimes against humanity, horrendous crimes. And in addition to that, we also negotiated something which is totally unprecedented. This is a development plan for those conflict-stricken zones and areas abandoned by the state because of the conflict, to benefit from that development plan. And of course, this cannot be done like snapping your fingers. So we need 15 years before we can implement this plan. And today we're now developing the plan. And for the very first time, we got a process that starts off from the very basics with consultation processes with local communities for priorities to be defined. Of course, not everything cannot be done at the same time. And at the end of the year, those consultation processes should be finalized so as to be able to develop that plan at the very beginning of next year. So all this is scheduled. And I know that there are quite a number of people that are criticizing, including the FARC. They're saying, oh, we did not respect the agreements. And so much the better. The FARC are into politics. And as far as I'm concerned, this is extremely positive. Being subject to getting some flack from both the right and the left wings means that we're really heading in the right direction.
That's a very interesting way of seeing things. There are some regions, border regions, Pacific coast, where the FARC are still present, 1,500 men who put pressure on the population and installing a terror regime. With the rise of insecurity, we see more and more killings of social leaders, human rights activists, increasing more and more. Of course, there are no real figures, but this is a situation. There are crucial issues.
Yes, these are issues, and the government is the first one to be concerned by those problems. Those are not idiosyncratic problems. You got side effects in the aftermath of a 54-year conflict. Of course, this will leave traces, and criminal outfits are trying to getting or squeezing themselves into the forts left by the FARC in very remote areas that have been abandoned by the government. And those 2 phenomena are not independent of one another, because the murders of social movement leaders are related to drug trafficking and the policies we're trying to implement so as to replace illegal crops with legal crops in a very forceful way and eradicate those crops that need to be eradicated. Because drug traffickers realize that if this works, they no longer will get commodities, though they murder leaders of social movements, including those that are supported by the FARC, and make sure that there should be a curt replacement of the crops, and the government is battling this phenomenon. We have the best forces, armed forces in our history. They have unprecedented credentials in this region, and we're really striking down on those criminal outfits. And as a proof now, the most powerful of those outfits, the Gulf Clan, is now about to surrender to justice, and this represents thousands of individuals. And they represent a great portion of drug trafficking, extortion, and crime, and they are going to surrender to Colombian justice.
Are you negotiating with them? Are these ongoing negotiations, and will you then give everything to justice?
The prosecutor is going to be jumping in because we're giving them no political status.
Well, one necessary question. A recent report was published. It was also mentioned by the UN. We see that coca plantation has soared to unprecedented levels, 210,000.
209,000.
Yes, that's right. So I wanted to ask you, how do you explain this phenomenon, and how can we also tackle it?
We're now facing this phenomenon thanks to a permanent and structural policy, and this is the first time. What was happening in the past? What happened in the last 30 to 40 years? In which Colombia was the first cocaine exporting country. We eliminated over 1.5 million hectares of land. We eradicated thousands and thousands of hectares, but crops are coming back overnight because of the armed conflict and because those areas were areas which the government withdrawn from, and it could not stay there forever, and crops took over. And we forced the FARC to introduce in their agenda, as a very specific item, the item related to the fight against drug trafficking. This was one of the worst plagues which Colombia experienced, and Colombia had to sacrifice more so than any other country when it came to fighting against drug trafficking. And for the very first time today, you can see that farmers, those cultivating coke, are now deliberately replacing illegal crops with legal crops. And in addition to that, the state is buying out those crops and are carrying out a development policy. And for the very first time, we are now coming up with a structural, long-lasting solutions. So why has there been an increase in the cultivated land surfaces? Because oil prices went up, and coke prices went up, and it became a lot more profitable. And this was somewhat of a perverted encouragement when we started talking about all those with in our talks with the FARC. A lot of farmers are going to say, okay, there's going to be a deliberate replacement, so we can take advantage of this, and hence am I going to be cultivating more so as to be able to take or tap into those profits. So we got a combination of several factors. You're mentioning, you said that Colombia is now experiencing a significant increase in coke crops. This is true, but let's compare ourselves to the United States. 81% of increase in cocaine consumption between 2013 and 2017. So there is shared responsibility. In France, people consume more cocaine. In Paris and London, people consume more cocaine. And look what is happening in Spain. So this is a worldwide problem. And Colombia is now encouraging for debate to be triggered, for another approach to emerge, because the world has waged a war against drug trafficking 45 years ago at the United Nations, but the war was lost because of a strictly repressive approach, a harsh approach which did not work. And as a result, it is quite instrumental. We need to really get together. And this problem cannot just be solved by Colombia or the United States, but by the international community. And we need a more effective approach.
Aren't you afraid now that the process is in the hands of your main opponents? Don't you think that now they will implement a more traditional policy of forced eradication, aerial fumigation and spraying, and that they will come back to an anti-drug policy like the one that you criticized?
They would cut off their nose to spite their face, so they say. And we already tried those systems and tragedies, and they did not work. And I was Minister of Defense, and I'm the Minister of Defense that really used overhead spraying the most in the whole history of the country. But crops increased. And another element we need to emphasize here, we improved quite significantly. Cocaine seizures sent off to foreign countries last year, 570 to 580 tons were seized, which represents over 50% of total production of cocaine. And this is a lot more effective than just imprisoning a farmer because he's cultivating cannabis or coke. And in Canada and the United States, production and consumption of cannabis, well, are legal.
Jesus Santrich, one of the FARC leaders, is accused by the United States of conspiracy for having sent cocaine to the U.S. He's now imprisoned in Colombia and is about to be extradited. So if Colombia and the Supreme Court authorizes this decision, would you sign on this extradition?
I will not make that decision. I have no time for this. The next government will have to make that decision. But you realize that those agreements need to be implemented. If someone commits a crime, and a serious crime after having signed the agreement, then that person will lose the benefits. It is quite clear all the FARC members may benefit from legal advantages, those that took part in the negotiations, and because they surrendered. And there are quite a number of people that criticize those advantages because they're too important. They're not too important because we saved thousands of lives, and in any peace process we need arbitration. We need to give and take. Negotiations are necessary, and those negotiations were carried out quite effectively. But the basic issue is as follows. Our country is experiencing a different reality, and the next government will be in a country without FARC and the Colombian Revolutionary Armed Forces. In other words, the most powerful guerrilla outfit. But the next government will also experience a country with a lot less poverty. We're the country that reduced poverty the most in the last 7 years in Latin America. And this is also the case with inequalities. We experienced a shameful situation after Haiti. We represented the Latin American country with the greatest inequalities, and today we're average. Now, of course, we have quite a number of people in poverty, but we lifted 4.5 million people from poverty. I'm sorry, 5.4 million people were lifted from poverty, and utter poverty was reduced by 50%, and we reduced inequalities quite significantly compared to other countries. As far as education is concerned, you were telling me that peace was the great success of my government. Yes, it is one factor, but all of the social indicators are quite instrumental. With a universal health coverage today, in terms of education, we launched a genuine revolution. Education is free up to the end of the secondary cycle, with an emphasis on little childhood or early childhood and access to higher education that increased by 20%. And so far as infrastructures are concerned, there's a genuine groundbreaking revolution. Our infrastructural project is the most important one of all the emerging countries, not just the Latin American countries, but of all the emerging countries. And those are not just governmental figures. Those figures actually stem from multilateral institutions and experts.
So all these successes that you mentioned, the peace deal, but also in other areas, has improved the visibility and the image of the country abroad. So you have the peace deal, the OECD, you joined the OECD. But within the country, unfortunately, your popularity rate is low, even if you compare it with other Latin American presidents.
Internally, because I'm more popular outside of the country.
But it's a bit of a contradiction. No one is a prophet in his own land.
Well, because in some ways, I was somewhat of a Churchillian figure. What does that mean exactly? I did what I thought was fair, although it was not popular. Let me just give you two recent examples. As far as the peace process, I was told, don't do this, just carry on with war. You were quite successful in this endeavor. I'm the Colombian president that got the greatest votes in the history of the country because I had clocked success stories in waging war. It might have been popular to continue, but this would not have been responsible or fair. How about the tax reform? I was told, don't carry out any tax reform. Just run up debt and just let the loads hand it down to the next government. I did not do this because this would not have been responsible, and history will bear me out and alleviate all those distortions related to, political distortions. Those results I'm talking about are going to be acknowledged in the future by public opinion and by citizens' perceptions. And this perception will change because this is what happened with quite a number of political figures.
Now, in terms of international affairs, I'd like to mention Venezuela. As you mentioned, the bridges have been burnt with the Maduro government for several months now. And do you think that we'll come back to a situation of high tension once Ivan Duque takes power?
Listen, Venezuela represents one of the most serious and complex problems we are experiencing. Colombia exerted quite a number of efforts. 1 million Venezuelans are living in our country, and we harbored them. We were quite open to them. We opened the doors to them. We reached out to them, and they were able to have access to health and education systems in Europe and the United States. Look at what is happening in those other countries. We opened our arms. We opened our doors to 1 million Venezuelans. We exerted great efforts in this respect, but at the same time, we were quite unflinching with the regime, which is responsible for those migration phenomena. We're the richest. We're talking about the richest country with the greatest oil deposits ahead of Saudi Arabia, and hunger is prevailing because people are dying, because people have no access to drugs, and Venezuelan citizens are getting no aid. The regime is respecting no human rights and has a totally Kafkaesque vision of reality. And that is the reason why we're exerting pressure for the international community to encourage for change in Venezuela for the benefit of the Venezuelans first and foremost, and for the benefit of Colombia, which is the country that is suffering most from that situation. And this is the case in the region and the world at large.
What are your thoughts about the relationship between the Colombian government, which has always been in line with Washington, and the President Trump?
It is not easy because he's unpredictable, but we've always fostered a bipartisan relationship, and for quite a long time I personally worked and fostered on that bipartisan relationship because, you know how important the Congress is and the role the Congress is playing in the international arena in the United States. And recently, the Trump administration proposed an aid for the benefit of Colombia, $245 million. And the Senate has approved $292 million. And this is what I want to maintain, this bipartisan relationship, including with the executive, and the problems emerging can be overcome thanks to diplomacy and thanks to the intelligence and pragmatism required in each one of those situations.
Right, to conclude, you said that unlike other presidents, you will let them govern, you will not run the Liberal Party, you will not create your own party. So what will you be doing once you leave power, unless, of course, apart from getting some rest?
I'll try to take advantage of my political retirement. I'm going to write. I was a journalist all my life.
A book, your memoirs?
A little of everything. I got quite a number of invitations to conferences, and I was asked to participate in academic work, and Nobel Prize, actually, that entails quite a lot of responsibility, and you got a very specific situation true in every individual. A few days ago, I became grandfather for the very first time. I got a granddaughter. She's remarkable. Her name is Celeste, and as a public figure, you sacrifice your family. I'd like to give more time to my family.
What about an international position? Would you like that?
No international or national position. I'm withdrawing from political life, and I'm going to dedicate to academic work and writing, and I'm going to rest, and I'll take advantage of life, and my grandchildren most especially.
Mr. President Juan Manuel Santos, thank you very much for taking stock of these 8 years with France 24. We'll now leave the President Juan Manuel Santos just a bit before the handover of power. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Señor Presidente.